8 weeks after a 10-year-old girl vanished on her way to school, a police officer typed her kidnapper's home address into a report. Nobody went to the address for another 8 years. The 2nd of March, 1998. A Monday morning in Vienna. In the Donaustadt district, on the far side of the Danube, a 10-year-old named Natascha Kampusch is walking to school on her own for the first time. It is about 200 meters. She has had an argument at home that morning. She is walking with her school bag, past the same building she passes every day. 200 meters is nothing. It is the distance a parent lets a child walk once they decide the child is old enough, which is a decision every family makes and almost never thinks about again. That morning was the first time. She had asked to be allowed to do it. That is in her own account. A 10-year-old negotiating for a small piece of independence, on a Monday, in March, on a road she had walked with an adult 100 times. A white van is parked on the street. As she comes level with it, a man gets out, picks her up, and puts her inside. It takes seconds. There is a witness, a 12-year-old girl on her own way to school, who sees it happen and tells an adult. The witness matters enormously and was treated as if it did not. A 12-year-old saw a girl being pulled into a white minibus. She told an adult. She gave a description of the vehicle. In a case where almost everything else was guesswork, one child gave investigators a physical object to look for on the first day. There is a second thing that first day gave them, and it is the one that gets forgotten. They knew the direction of travel. They knew it was a vehicle, not a person on foot. That narrows a search from every hiding place in a city to a set of roads and a set of registration records. And they had a time. Not an approximate window, a school run, on a Monday, between about 7 and 8 in the morning. A vehicle, a direction, and an hour. Compared with most missing person cases, that is an enormous amount to start with. And that is the last time anybody sees Natascha Kampusch for 3,096 days. 3,096 days. It is worth converting that, because the number goes past too quickly. She went in as a 10-year-old in a school anorak and came out as an 18-year-old adult. She missed every year of secondary school. She missed the introduction of the euro. She went in when Austria still had a shilling and came out into a country that had changed currency, government and decade without her. What happened over those 8.5 years has been told before, and told badly, as a curiosity, as a horror story, as a set of theories. This is not that. This is about the paperwork. Because the man who took her was named in a police report 8 weeks after she disappeared. With his van. With his description. With his street address. And she stayed in that building for another 8 years. Donaustadt is the 22nd district of Vienna, the flat side, out past the Danube, built up fast in the 1970s with long municipal housing estates. It is not a bad place. It is an ordinary one. Rennbahnweg, where she lived, is one of the big estates, thousands of flats, built in the 70s, the kind of place that gets described in newspapers with a particular tone. That tone is going to matter later, because a great deal of what was written about this family over the following decade was really about the postcode. Understand what that meant for the coverage. A missing child from an estate is written about differently from a missing child from a house with a garden. It is not stated outright. It comes through in the adjectives, and in what gets mentioned about the parents, and in how quickly a journalist reaches for the word troubled. Austria in 1998 was also a country that had not had a case like this. There was no template. No national alert system of the kind that existed later. The machinery that a modern disappearance triggers within an hour simply did not exist, and a great deal of what happened next was improvised. Natascha was 10. Her parents were separated. She had spent the weekend with her father and come back on the Sunday night, and there had been an argument that Monday morning, and she left the flat upset. Every account of this case mentions that argument, and it is worth being careful about why. It is mentioned because her mother had to live with it afterwards. The last exchange between them was a bad one, and that fact was reported and re-reported for years, in a country where the coverage of this family became something close to a national sport. It has nothing to do with what happened. A man in a van took a child off a street. The argument is only in the story because it makes a better paragraph, and because somebody always wants the family to have a share of the blame. This is a pattern worth naming because it repeats in every case on this channel. When a child is taken, a certain kind of coverage immediately starts looking for the household's contribution to it. The Smart family got a version of it. Julian Hernandez's mother got a version of it. Brigitta Cerny got the worst version of it, for the longest time. Her mother, Brigitta, spent the next 8 years being a public figure without having chosen to be one, and then spent the years after the escape being one under worse conditions. Whatever you think about anything in this case, that is the position she was put in by a man in a van. The search that followed was, at the time, the largest Austria had ever run. There was a witness, which is more than most cases get. The 12-year-old had seen a white minibus. That description went out. Police began working through the registration records for white vans of that type in the Vienna area, and there were about 700 of them. Except that the description was of a white minibus, and Austria in 1998 had rather a lot of white minibuses. This is the part of police work that never makes it into the retellings, not the insight, but the arithmetic. 700 vehicles, each one attached to an owner who had to be found, visited, asked where he had been on a Monday morning, and either cleared or not cleared. That is not a dramatic piece of police work. It is a list. And lists are how most cases are actually solved. And it was being done alongside everything else, the searches, the hotline, the international inquiries, the press. The van list was one work stream among many, staffed by ordinary officers, running for months. It is genuinely difficult work and there is no glamour in it at all. There is also a limit that nobody in 1998 could do anything about. There were no mobile phone records to trace, no CCTV network across a city, no automatic number plate recognition on the roads out of Vienna. Everything had to be done by hand, by people, on paper. It is worth resisting the temptation to file that under primitive. Investigators then were doing the same job with worse tools, and they got a great deal right. The van list was the correct instinct. It produced the correct name. The tools were not the problem. Meanwhile the country did what countries do with a missing child that photogenic. Her face went onto television and stayed there. Psychics wrote in. Sightings came from Hungary, from Italy, from a ferry in the Baltic. Every one had to be logged and cleared by someone with a finite number of hours. There was also, very early, a theory that she had run away, that a 10-year-old upset after an argument had simply gone. It is an entirely reasonable first hypothesis and police have to hold it. But a hypothesis held too long is a door closed, and the door it closes is the one marked abduction by a stranger in a vehicle. And through it all, Natascha Kampusch was 25 kilometers away, in a town called Strasshof in der Nordbahn, on the far side of the Marchfeld plain, about half an hour up the road. 25 kilometers. If you left Rennbahnweg in a car and drove northeast across the Marchfeld, flat farmland, long straight roads, wind turbines now, you would be outside the house in about half an hour. It is not a remote place. It is a commuter town on a railway line, with a supermarket and a school and neighbors on both sides. She has said that in the early years she could sometimes hear traffic through the ventilation. Whether that is exact does not matter much. What matters is the geometry, an ordinary town, an ordinary street, an ordinary house, half an hour from the flat she left. Which brings us to April, 1998, and to the single most uncomfortable document in this entire case. A police officer working the van list produced a report on a man in Strasshof. The report said he owned a white van of the right type. It said he lived alone. It described him as isolated, poor at dealing with other people, and it recorded a stated interest in children. Take a moment on what that officer actually did, because he is the only person in this story who did the thing correctly at the time. He worked his section of a 700 name list. He did not just tick a box. He looked at a man, formed a view, and wrote down that the view was worth acting on. We do not know his name and he has never been made a public figure, which is probably how he wants it. But if you want to know what good police work looks like on an ordinary Tuesday, it looks like a man on a long list writing down that number 400 and something is worth someone's time. And it gave his address. The report went up the chain. It was not acted on. Wolfgang Pricklepil was not visited. His house was not looked at. His garage was not looked at. And underneath that garage, behind a concrete slab and a steel door, was a room of about 5 square meters with a 10-year-old girl in it. She would be in that building for another 8 years, 4 months and 1 week. I want to be careful here, because it is very easy to be clever about this in hindsight. 700 vans is 700 reports. Most of them are about men who own a van and live alone, because a great many men own a van and live alone. Somebody has to decide which ones are worth a knock on the door, and that person is working with a list, not a crystal ball. Investigations triage constantly, because they have to. Every case is a queue and the queue is always longer than the people available to work it. A lead that says a man owns the right kind of van and lives alone is, on any ordinary day, a lead that goes into the pile. What makes this one different is that it was not only the van. It was the van, plus the isolation, plus a recorded interest in children, plus the address, in a document that reached a desk 8 weeks after a 10-year-old was pulled off a street by a man in that exact kind of vehicle. But this one had the address. And the description. And nobody went. There is a version of this film that stops here and spends 30 minutes being angry about it. I understand the impulse and I think it is the wrong film. What is more useful is to ask what the rest of the 8 years actually looked like, because that is the part that explains why she did not simply walk out, and it is the part almost every telling gets wrong. The room was underneath the garage, reached through a hole in the floor of a storage pit, behind a door that weighed about 150 kilograms. Getting to it meant lifting a concrete slab in the floor of a pit inside the garage, moving a safe that stood on top of the entrance, and opening a door that a 10-year-old could not have opened from the inside even if she had known how. It also meant that if anything had happened to him, a car accident, a heart attack, anything at all, nobody would have found her. She said that herself afterwards, and it is the detail that makes the 8 years feel less like captivity and more like being buried alive with a timer nobody could see. She has also described what the routine did to time itself. Days with no daylight and no clock run together. She has said she lost track of how long she had been there, and had to reconstruct it afterwards from things she remembered hearing. 8.5 years is a number she learned later, like everybody else. 5 square meters. No window. Sound insulated. A ventilation pipe. For the first years she was in it almost all the time, and for a long stretch of that she was in it alone for many hours a day while he went to work. 5 square meters is about the size of a small bathroom. There was a bed, a shelf, and eventually a few possessions. The light was electric and he controlled it. The air came through a pipe and he controlled that too. In the first years she was down there for the greater part of every day. She has described the first period as the worst of it, and described what got her through it in terms that are strikingly practical: routines, small tasks, a radio, the deliberate construction of an interior life. A 10-year-old worked out, alone, that she had to build something to survive inside. He gave her books. He let her listen to the radio. At one stage he brought down schoolbooks and she taught herself out of them, which is how an 18-year-old walked out of that house able to hold a conversation about history and politics with journalists who expected a feral child. None of that is a mitigation, and she has never presented it as one. It is a description of the specific shape of what was done to her, which was not neglect. It was ownership. He was building the person he wanted, and part of building her was teaching her things. What was done to her in that house she has written about herself, once, in her own words, in her own book. She has been consistent for nearly 20 years that the cataloging of it is not the story and that she does not want it recirculated. So this film is not going to do that. It happened. She has said so. Move on. What is worth saying, because it is the part people get wrong, is that she was not simply locked in a box for 8 years. It changed. And the way it changed is what eventually made the escape possible. The captivity had phases. Years underground with almost no daylight. Then a slow, calculated widening, upstairs, then the garden, then supervised trips outside. Each widening was a reward inside a system he controlled, and each one also, without his ever intending it, moved her closer to a door. Wolfgang Pricklepil was 35 when he took her. A communications technician. He had worked for Siemens. He was, by every account of everybody who knew him, completely unremarkable. There is no dramatic backstory. No known history of violence. No convictions. He had a job, a car he polished, a house he was renovating, and a mother who visited at weekends, which is why, for years, Natascha Kampusch had to be completely silent every weekend. His mother came at weekends and he was, by every account, an attentive son. For 8.5 years, a woman visited that house regularly, ate meals in it, and never knew there was a room under the garage. The two facts sit beside each other and there is nothing to add to them. He lived in his mother's house in Strasshof. He was tidy. He was polite to neighbors. He drove a white van, and later a BMW that he cared about a great deal. Nobody who knew him has ever described noticing anything. And at some point before March 1998, he dug out the floor under his garage, poured a concrete chamber, fitted a steel door on a hinge that could be sealed from outside, and ran a ventilation pipe to it. The work took time and effort and money, and it was done in a residential street, in a house with neighbors, without anybody wondering what it was for. A man renovating his garage is the least interesting thing on any street in Europe. It is also, in its way, the answer to every theory about networks and accomplices. This was not an operation. It was one man with a cement mixer and a plan, working alone in a garage, for months, on a house he had inherited the use of. That is not a crime of opportunity. A man does not build a soundproofed cellar on the chance that something might come up. He built it first, and then he went out and found a child to put in it. The van, the route, the timing, all of it was planned around a room that already existed. Which is the detail that makes the ignored report in April so hard to look at. He was not clever. He had not covered his tracks. His van matched. His profile matched. His address was on a piece of paper in a police building in Vienna. Over the years the arrangement changed, and it changed in a way that is genuinely hard for people to hear about. She was brought up into the house. She was made to do housework. She ate meals with him. Later she was taken outside, to a garden, to shops, on one occasion on a skiing trip. There are people who saw her. Nobody said anything, and nobody had any reason to. He gave her jobs. He had her help with the renovation of the house, the same house. There were periods when she slept upstairs. He bought her things, and he took things away, and the whole arrangement ran on a system of reward and withdrawal that is the same system every controlling relationship runs on, only with a locked cellar underneath it. There is a detail from the later years that people find hardest of all. On at least one occasion they were seen together in public by someone who thought something looked wrong, and nothing came of it. Not because anybody was careless, because a young woman standing beside a man in a shop is the least remarkable sight in the world. There were also, in the last years, moments when she was briefly alone in circumstances where she could in theory have run, and did not. She has been asked about those more than about anything else, and her answer has not changed. She was not weighing a locked door, she was weighing what she had been taught would follow. This is where audiences reliably ask the question, and it deserves a straight answer rather than an embarrassed one. Why did she not run? Why did she not say something to a shop assistant, to a lift attendant, to anybody? Because she had been told, from 10 years old, what would happen to her and to anybody who helped her. Because the house was described to her as wired with explosives. Because she had spent formative years learning that compliance was the thing that kept her alive, and because a person who controls your food, your light, your air, and your body does not need chains after a while. And because at the point you are considering running, you are not making a decision as the person you were before. You are making it as someone who has been systematically taught, over years, that the world outside will not help and that the attempt will cost more than it can possibly win. She also had to weigh what running would cost if it failed. Not an abstract punishment, a specific one, in a specific room, administered by the only person she had spoken to since she was 10. That calculation is not cowardice. It is arithmetic done by somebody with far better information about the downside than any of us have. People who study this do not treat it as a mystery. It has a name and a literature and a long list of cases behind it. The only people who find it inexplicable are the ones who have never had to consider it. She has said all of this publicly and at length. And she has also said, repeatedly, that the question itself carries an accusation, and that she would like people to stop asking it in that tone. That seems fair. But the loosening is also the thing that ended it. A person kept permanently in a cellar cannot escape from a cellar. A person who has been let out to clean a car in a driveway can. The 23rd of August, 2006. Early afternoon. Natascha Kampusch is 18 years old. She is in the driveway, vacuuming the inside of Pricklepill's BMW. The vacuum cleaner is running, which matters, because it is loud. His mobile phone rings. He cannot hear it over the noise, so he walks away from the car, 20 meters, maybe 30, to take the call. Everything turns on those 30 meters and that noise. He was not careless in any other way for 8.5 years. He was careless for about 5 minutes, because a vacuum cleaner is loud and a phone call needs quiet. She had thought about it for years. She has described rehearsing it, imagining routes, deciding in advance what she would do if a gap ever appeared. The gap was 4 minutes wide and she had already worked out what to do with it. What she did in those 4 minutes was not panic and it was not luck. She had a route in her head. She knew that going over a fence put a barrier between them. She knew that a house with somebody in it was better than an open street. She had rehearsed the whole thing in a room with no windows. She leaves the vacuum running. Leaving it running is the detail that tells you she had thought about this. The noise that stopped him hearing his phone is the same noise that stopped him hearing her go. She goes over a fence, through gardens, along a street, and she knocks on windows and asks people to call the police. 2 of them do not. The third, a woman in her 70s, does. Read that again. She asked 3 households for help and 2 of them did not open the door. A girl none of them recognized, agitated, saying something that made no sense, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in a quiet street. Two people made an entirely understandable decision, and it was the wrong one. The third was an elderly neighbor who let her in and called the police. Whoever she was, she is the last link in the chain, and the chain had exactly one link left by then. It is worth holding on to how narrow this was. If the phone had not rung. If the vacuum had been quieter. If she had knocked on a fourth door instead of stopping at the third. Every one of those is a coin toss, and the whole thing came down to about 4 minutes. When the police arrived, she gave them her name and her date of birth. They did not believe her at first. Then somebody checked the file, and the file was 8.5 years old, and it matched. Consider what it takes to be believed at that moment. She had been gone since she was 10. Her file was one of the most famous in the country and had been dormant for years. The officers in front of her were being told, by a young woman they had never seen, that she was the girl from the posters. She was 5'1" and weighed about 48 kilograms. She had been gone since she was 10. And she had walked out on her own, in daylight, because a phone rang. The photographs from that day exist and they are not shown here, because she has spent 20 years asking not to be reduced to them. What can be said is that the Austrian police confirmed her identity within hours, and that the confirmation came from a file that had been opened since she was in year 4 of school. Wolfgang Pricklepil worked out what had happened within minutes. He drove into Vienna. He met a friend. He walked to the northern railway station, and that evening he stepped in front of a train. He was 36. There is a small, bleak detail in the timing. He had hours. He could have driven anywhere. What he did was go into the city, see one person, and then walk to a railway station in a district he knew, the same railway line, as it happens, that gives the town where he kept her its name. He never gave an account of anything. There was no interview, no trial, no explanation of why he built the room or how he chose her. Everything anybody knows about the inside of that house for 8.5 years comes from one person, and she was the child in it. Which means there is no answer to the first question anybody asks. Why her? Whether he had watched her, whether it was that morning, that road, that anorak, or whether any child walking alone on any street would have done. There is no file that answers it, and there never will be. That single fact is the engine of everything ugly that came afterwards. When the only witness is also the victim, and the other party is dead, there is a permanent open space where an explanation should be, and people fill open spaces. Within weeks there were books. Within months there were theories about accomplices, about films, about official cover-ups. Some of it came from people with genuine unanswered questions. A lot of it came from people who found a young woman's own account of her own life less interesting than the version they preferred. The Austrian coverage that followed was, by wide agreement inside Austria, one of the worst episodes in the modern history of that country's press. Her medical details, her family, her finances, her flat, her weight, all of it was material. She was 19. She was also, immediately, worth money. Rights, serializations, exclusives. A 19-year-old with no education past year 4, no work history and no family structure to fall back on was suddenly at the center of a commercial scramble, and every decision she made about it was then held against her. And the more she declined to behave the way the coverage wanted, the more the coverage decided there was something to uncover. That loop, she is composed, therefore she is hiding something, ran for years and has never entirely stopped. It is worth being blunt about the mechanism, because it is not unique to Austria and it is not unique to her. A survivor who behaves unexpectedly makes an audience uncomfortable. Deciding that she is concealing something resolves the discomfort, and it costs the audience nothing. Austria then did something that not every country does after a case like this. It investigated itself, publicly, and it published the result. A commission was set up to examine how the original investigation had been run. It went back through the files, including the April 1998 report, and it confirmed what by then everybody suspected: the lead had existed, it had been specific, and it had not been followed. This part deserves credit, because it is rarer than it should be. A state institution examined its own failure in public and confirmed it, in writing, in a document anybody can read. It did not have to. Plenty of institutions in plenty of countries would not have. And there were consequences. Senior officers left. Procedures around lead handling and case review were changed. It is difficult, from outside Austria and at this distance, to say how much of that changed anything in practice, but the report exists, the failure is on the record, and that is not nothing. There is one more thing the Commission could not resolve, and it is the thing Austrians still argue about. Not whether the police failed, that is established, but why the failure was so total, and whether anybody was ever properly held to account for it. Reasonable people there still disagree. What is not in dispute anywhere is the sequence. A child was taken in March. A report naming the man, the vehicle, and the address reached a police desk in April. She came out in August, 8 years later, on her own. Everything else in this case is argued about. That sequence is not. It also addressed the theories, which by then had become their own industry. Whether he had help. Whether there was a network. Whether the escape happened the way she said. The official conclusion was that Priklopil had most likely acted alone. That conclusion has never satisfied everybody, and I am not going to pretend the argument is over. It is not, in Austria, even now. But there is a difference between an unanswered question and a suppressed answer, and most of what circulates about this case treats the first as if it were proof of the second. What did emerge, and what is not in dispute, is the scale of what was missed. Not one lead. A pattern. The van list, the report in April, and later questions about how the file was handled after the escape, enough that the review itself became a story in Austria for years afterwards. The Commission also produced a moment that damaged it badly. Its chairman made a public remark about Kampusch's life before the abduction, a remark that suggested her years in that cellar may not have been worse than what she came from. It caused an eruption. It ended in court. Whatever was meant by it, consider what it does. A commission set up to examine how the state failed a 10-year-old produced, as one of its most quoted lines, a suggestion that the 10-year-old's own family was the real problem. That is the shape a lot of the coverage of this case took, for years. Natascha Kampusch was 18 when she walked out of that driveway. She is in her late 30s now, and what she has done since is not what anybody expected. She gave interviews on her own terms, very early, and she was criticized for it. She wrote a book. She hosted a television program. She has spoken in public, repeatedly, for nearly 20 years, using her own name, about a thing that most people would spend a lifetime trying to get out from under. The criticism she received for it is worth naming, because it is a pattern that follows survivors everywhere. She was too composed. She spoke too well. She did not seem broken enough. She used the word he for her captor instead of a worse one. Each of those was, at some point, offered publicly as evidence that something about her account did not add up. What it actually was is a 19-year-old refusing to perform the version of herself that the audience had already written. And she did one thing that almost nobody understands, and that gets brought up every time her name appears. She acquired the house. The actual house, in Strasshof, with the cellar under the garage. She has explained it more than once. If the house were sold, it would be sold to someone who wanted it for what happened there. If it were demolished, the site would still be the site. Owning it meant that nobody else got to decide what it was for. People find that unbearable, and the reaction to it tells you more about the audience than about her. A woman who was held in a building for 8 years took ownership of the building. That is not a symptom. That is somebody taking the last decision in the room. There is a version of a survivor that audiences are comfortable with. Broken, grateful, quiet, and preferably absent. Natascha Kampusch has spent 20 years being none of those, in public, under her own name, in a country that has not made it easy. She trained as a jeweler. She has run a television interview program. She has written more than one book. She has spent 2 decades doing the ordinary, unglamorous work of building an adult life in a country where a substantial part of the population still believes it knows more about her than she does. She has also been consistent about something that gets very little coverage. She has repeatedly refused to describe her captor as a monster, not out of loyalty, but because she says calling him a monster puts him outside the human category and therefore outside the reach of any lesson. He was a technician from Strasshof who polished his car. That is the frightening part. So what do we take out of this one? Not that the police were stupid. 700 vans is 700 reports, and the officer who wrote the good one did his job. The failure was above him, in the part of the process where somebody decides which of 700 pieces of paper is worth a knock on a door. There is a specific lesson in the shape of the failure, and it is worth stating plainly, because it generalizes. The system did not fail to find the information. It found the information and then failed to move it across a room. Those are completely different failures, and only one of them is about resources. A tip line, a van list, a record search, these produce leads. What decides a case is the layer above, the judgment about which of those leads gets a person and a car and an afternoon. That layer is almost never examined, because it produces no documents when it works and no documents when it does not. It is also the layer that no amount of technology fixes. A better database in 1998 would have surfaced the same report to the same desk. The question of whether somebody drives to Strasshof on a Thursday afternoon is a human one, and it always will be. And not that this could not happen again. The failure here was not exotic. It was a triage decision inside a queue, made by people under pressure with incomplete information, which is the ordinary condition of every investigation everywhere, every day. And not that she was rescued. She was not. There was no raid, no breakthrough, no tip. The state that had her address in April of 1998 was not the thing that got her out in August of 2006. An 18-year-old put down a vacuum cleaner and went over a fence. If you have watched the other films on this channel, you will have noticed the shape by now. Julian Hernandez was found because a computer rejected 9 digits. Elizabeth Smart was found because a 9-year-old remembered a voice. Natascha Kampusch was not found at all, she left. 3 cases, 3 countries worth of searching, and in none of them did the search find the child. And in all 3, the thing that ended it was small enough to be missed. 9 digits on a form. A voice a child recognized 4 months late. A phone call that made a man walk 30 meters away from a vacuum cleaner. There is one difference between this case and the other 2, and it is the reason I wanted to make it. In the Hernandez case and the Smart case, the small thing worked. Somebody noticed, and acted, and a child came home. Here the small thing was noticed, written down, filed, and then nobody carried it up a flight of stairs. That is not a comforting conclusion, and I am not going to dress it up as one. If you are waiting for the searches to work, the record of these 3 cases says something uncomfortable about the odds. The report existed. It was 8 weeks in. It had the address on it. Everything after that, the 8 years, the cellar, the driveway, the phone call, happened downstream of a piece of paper that nobody walked across a room with. Thank you for watching.